Welcome to Ambition's Apex, your guide to mastering the art of physique transformation and achieving peak performance across all arenas of life. Our mission is not just to sculpt bodies, but to change lives, empowering you towards excellence. Dive in with us as we explore insights and strategies designed to elevate you towards your journey of self-improvement. Enjoy the ascent. Welcome back to another episode. My name is Sean Irwin. For those that do not know, I am owner and head coach of Saga Coaching. We work with physique enhancement and health systems. And today, accompanied with me, I have Danielle, who is also a coach with Saga Coaching. Danielle, how are we doing today?
Doing good. How are you?
Fantastic. So today we are talking about caffeine, nicotine, sleep, circadian rhythm, and how they kind of coincide and what we want to be looking at, some things to take into consideration. And this is going to be kind of a science-based talk with some kind of just open discussion, personal experience, that kind of thing as well. So, us as, me as a past physique athlete and currently just wanting to optimize my ability to function at a high level when it comes to my work and look and feel my best, as well as Danielle being an IFBB figure pro. These things are pretty important to us, and these are very, very important topics to understand if you want to get the most out of your performance, if you're an athlete, or if you are just an individual wanting to perform at the highest level possible within your own life and whatever your goals may be as well. So this topic matters a lot because stimulants are the most widely used psychoactive substances globally, primarily caffeine. There's very few people I work with that don't consume caffeine. I actually don't think that there is any that I can think of at the moment. So caffeine is widely used, and it is a drug, and it is something that we all utilize. It is relatively safe for the most part. So there's good reason for it. And, I love my coffee in the morning, my double shot of espresso. Everybody loves caffeine in some capacity, or I should say most people enjoy caffeine in some capacity. So it's important to talk about and understand a little bit better as well. Many athletes and professionals rely on caffeine daily. As I mentioned, sleep disruption is one of the most under-recognized consequences of this. So just managing it appropriately and making sure that we're, being relatively responsible in terms of how we're dosing it, where we're getting it from, what time of the day we're consuming it, etc. Some considerations there can be really important. And then people often judge stimulants based on perceived energy rather than recovery costs. So usually we're leaning into stimulants to kind of compensate for maybe, fatigue that we're accumulating or trying to kind of compensate for, essentially, etc. That's essentially what these things are going to do. Like nicotine and caffeine are more of a fatigue mask rather than something that actually gives you energy. So that's something to take into consideration, something that we're going to cover here today. And then long-term performance is constrained by sleep quality, not stimulant intake. So the stimulants themselves are not necessarily the bad guy here. A lot of this is going to be the negative kind of downstream effects of that in terms of trickling into your sleep quality and your cortisol rhythm, a lot of different things that we want to take into consideration here. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Now, Danielle, do you specifically as an athlete have, with your personal experience, any concerns or things that you've kind of focused on managing within your stimulant intake when it comes to sleep, specifically fatigue accumulation, especially like during prep and off season and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'll say now I'm much more aware than I used to be about my stimulant intake. That's honestly, I think at the beginning of bodybuilding, I never paid attention to how much caffeine I was really consuming in a day. And that was not something I was ever told to watch either. So I definitely am much more aware of it now and watching how much caffeine is in certain things. I have my routine. I'll usually have 1 cup of coffee in the morning, and it's a couple hours after I have woken up, and then I will have some kind of caffeine stimulant, whether it's another cup of coffee or maybe half a dose of pre-workout in the afternoon or an energy drink, something like that. I make sure to cut that off. Latest I would have that is 3 o'clock. So I have my routine, but like I said, it was something I never paid attention to before becoming aware of how it can affect my sleep, how it can affect my training, how it can affect like kind of a downstream of things.
Yeah, 100%. And like I said, caffeine specifically is more of a mask of fatigue rather than it giving you actual energy, right? So when you start to have that paradigm shift and understand that, where you're just masking fatigue, and that it's going to catch up to you at some point. But that's not to say that we don't enjoy caffeine and it doesn't have fantastic application and most of us use it, right? It's just understanding it a little bit better so that we can use it more appropriately and keep it more sustainable too, because usually the instability of it is when we're consuming like high doses in acute settings, and like our dosages are really fluctuating, or the timing is really off, or we're consuming it too late. And a lot of it's just because we're not necessarily aware, right? So that stuff's important. It's similar to like with food, right? You know, sometimes bad habits can accumulate from just not having an awareness of what you're consuming food wise, right? So when you start to have that paradigm shift and start to understand nutrition a little bit better, you're more conscious of your behaviors and habits too. So it's not something that we need to be absolute sticklers about. We're not here to tell you to not consume caffeine or anything like that. It's just really understanding it better, and which is what we try to educate here with both Ambitions Apex as well as within the Saga ecosystem too. So we'll start with circadian rhythm a little bit because it's going to help us understand the rest of it better in terms of why we're taking certain consideration or certain things into consideration when it comes to stimulant intake, because most of it's going to coincide with that essentially. So circadian rhythms are 24-hour biological cycles, and this kind of coincides with the rise and the fall of the sun. So a lot of this is going to be based on or stimulated by or regulated by light exposure essentially. So controlled primarily by, the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to kind of regulate this based on inputs essentially. Light exposure through the retina is the main synchronizing signal. So like I said, light is light exposure, and then the lack thereof light exposure is the primary thing that's going to be regulating our circadian rhythm. So that's why you're going to hear things like get sunlight throughout the day or right when you wake up, because that's going to be the initial setting of that, as well as timing. So your body kind of syncs up with the timing as well. So, going to sleep trying to go to sleep around the same time every night, and more importantly, waking up at the same time every day is what's going to really be helpful here in terms of setting that circadian rhythm, and then syncing up the light exposure with that. So getting sunlight when you wake up, viewing some level of sunlight, or just getting out. Now, it's not ideal, but in terms of light exposure, it's not exclusive to the sun. So we can be looking at things like even just turning on your lights, right? Like that helps to an extent. So, and we'll hear things like demonizing blue light and stuff like that. It's not necessarily inherently bad to get blue light and light in general, bright light in general throughout the day. If anything, that can be of benefit, but obviously it's ideal to get actual sunlight because that's what our bodies are just biologically designed to be consuming essentially as far as inputs go. So, but getting bright light just in general is good, but that's where it can become detrimental in the evening. So when the sun starts to fall, when our bodies are naturally designed to stop having light, like bright light inputs, and we continue that bright light input, our circadian rhythm gets all kinds of mixed up. So our systems just aren't understanding what time of the day it is. It doesn't have that 24-hour kind of synchronized rhythm essentially, which is what we're trying to accomplish. So that's where like blue light blocking glasses, more specifically red tinted ones that are sunset glasses, can come into play, where we can put those on and kind of start to essentially dim lights, because a lot of us are still going to be on our phones to some extent. We're going to want to maybe watch an episode of TV with our significant other, whatever it may be. Realistically, this day and age, we're not going to be able to just sit around with candlelight, like as when the sun goes down. That would be ideal, to sit around just like candlelight and, a campfire or whatever it may be. And some of us may be able to enjoy that every once in a while, but realistically, there's tools available to us to kind of replicate that to some extent, and giving yourself a 7 to 8 hour window of sleep as well. And I say window because window of opportunity necessarily, rather than it being like you need to get 8 hours of sleep, because sometimes that can put a pressure that is almost, it negatively impacts your sleep, if that makes sense. So you almost have anxiety around like pressure of like trying to get 8 hours of sleep. Just give yourself the opportunity. So in bed, lights out, phone set aside, all that kind of stuff. So we'll cover some other tools here today. Danielle, what are some things you do, because you're extremely busy, as am I. So what are some things that you do within your kind of schedule that help you manage light exposure a little bit better, or in terms of just setting up your circadian rhythm a little bit better as well? There's other like specific sciences we're going to go into, like body temperature, that kind of stuff. But what are some things that you do just habit wise that help you?
Yeah, I mean, right now with like daylight savings and all of that, and I'm able to like wake up and go take my dog out. So, I mean, if you have an animal you can go take out, that's your light exposure in the morning. That's an easy opportunity to get movement and light exposure. Most of the time during the day, I'm indoors, but in the evening, I'll make sure to like when I come home, lights are dim. I don't turn any like overhead lights on. Might be like the ones under my cabinet. I'll use my like blue light blocking glasses. I don't turn on the TV. No loud noises. It's just like my bedtime routine. Shower and get to bed because everything else is like prepped and ready to go. So it's kind of as minimal as possible. Kind of keep it chill in the evening. It makes it tough when like in the morning, if you're like a really early riser and there's not light outside, like you said, then you kind of have to have that artificial light. But there's so many options like on Amazon that you can purchase those things and get immediate light exposure in the morning.
Absolutely. And this is going to be a rare occasion where I openly talk some shit here. If you are wearing the red tinted blue light blocking glasses throughout the day or like midday, stop doing that. We want to actually get light exposure during the day. You're not doing yourself any favors. I see individuals wearing them when they're recording podcasts like midday kind of stuff. It's a little bit performative. And if you understand circadian rhythm well enough, you're not going to want to be blocking brighter lights throughout the day. Now, it's one thing, and I'm going to give some leeway here. It's one thing if your eyes get strained from staring at screens all day, wearing lighter tinted blue light blocking glasses, but the red tinted ones are meant for like when the sun has gone down and it's actual evening, and it's trying to kind of replicate what it would be like if the sun was setting and you were just sitting around a campfire essentially. So these are an example of, here, I'll show anybody that's actually watching the video. These are from Raw Optics. I've been wearing these since 2017 when the company launched. And these have been like paramount when it comes to my routine. I put these on every evening when the sun goes down. That way I can still watch TV and stuff like that with my significant other without as much negative impact. So they're extremely helpful, but I do not recommend wearing those during the day. If you get eye strain, wear the daylight ones that are more like yellow tinted, or the ones that you can get from like prescription glasses and stuff. With the like kind of like light blue tint, whatever it is. They're just like the normal blue light blocking glasses, and that can help with like the eye strain and stuff. But just a little PSA there essentially. Now, we talked about inputs, and there's other things that like regulate your circadian rhythm a bit. There's like other nuances to it, like temperature, that kind of stuff, which we'll cover here in a moment. But some of the outputs that the circadian clock kind of drives is going to be something like things like cortisol rhythm. So usually cortisol kind of peaks in the morning. We're going to talk about this a little bit more as well, but cortisol kind of peaks in the morning upon waking, and then it kind of climbs down throughout the day, and we'll get smaller peaks throughout the day as well. Like when we train, for example, we'll get a little bit of a cortisol peak, or when we consume stimulants, that kind of thing. And then melatonin secretion. So this plays into some other things that we're going to talk about here in terms of sleep pressure. So this kind of accumulates when you put on the red tinted blue light blocking glasses, or just the light blocking glasses. I don't like to call them blue light blocking glasses because they're for bright light in general. So like all light, they help you just like dim the light down essentially. But when you put those on, you can literally start to feel sleepier over time. When you like have them on for like an hour or so, you'll actually start to feel more tired, because melatonin secretion starts to climb up when the lights go down essentially. So if you're feeling like you need to supplement melatonin, for example, or you're like, I need to take more melatonin, it may just be that you need to stop staring at your phone, like 2 inches away from your face right before you go to sleep, because that may be helpful in terms of just your natural melatonin production. So a lot of it's lined up. Like I said, this is an output based on your circadian rhythm that you've set up for yourself. So these are things that, a lot of us have within our control. So focusing on this because it's going to drive more melatonin secretion naturally without us having to supplement it. Core body temperature. So this is another output, but we can do things environmentally that are inputs that kind of essentially line up with the output, if that makes sense. So core body temperature is going to decrease towards sleep. And this is why having lower temperature, I believe the evidence supports about 65 to 69 degrees within the room is going to be ideal. I sleep with it around 66 degrees, 67. That's usually pretty comfortable for me. And we wanted to kind of essentially sync up with the lowering of the internal core body temperature as we head towards sleep. Now, one thing that happens here that's kind of interesting is skin temperature actually starts to increase. So we kind of get almost this insulation effect where the internals start to come down and then the skin starts to warm up essentially. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to use heavy blankets in a cold room. So we can have insulation, but we want the room temperature to be reduced. And I say it's better to have heavier blankets with a cold room than to have thinner blankets with a warmer room. So heavier blankets are fine. You can even layer it and kind of peel off layers throughout the night if you get too hot, whatever it may be, but it is best to keep your room cold. So I know that some people can be a little bit sensitive to that, but it's something that can take some getting used to. And like I said, if you want to layer blankets on and stuff, you can do that. But Danielle, have you ran with your room pretty cold? Or I think we've talked about this in the past. What are your habits with that?
Yeah, I probably could drop honestly down the temperature a little bit. I think I'm keeping it around the 69 to 70 right now, but I'll have the fan going. And then I do have some blankets. I'll usually peel them off throughout the night. But I think that's definitely helped, is keeping the air a little bit cooler, keeping the fan going. I think the tendency, I don't know if it's more of a woman thing, is to bundle up before bed just to be cozy, but it makes a difference when you're hot, when your body's hot going to bed. You're not as comfortable, you're not as relaxed. So yeah, being able to keep the AC cooler is definitely a win.
100%. And one thing that can help with this is if you have this technology available within your home is setting a schedule on your thermostat. Mine is set. I'm still learning mine because I just moved into this new place not so long ago, but I'm still learning the thermostat, trying to set up the schedule appropriately. But how I like to do is start to ramp down the temperature in the evening. So once we're kind of winding down, I'll start to crank it down a few degrees. And then when I'm getting ready for bed is when I'll really drop it. So that way I'm not freezing leading into us going to bed and that kind of thing, and we can still kind of move around and stuff. Now, another thing that's output that the circadian clock is going to drive is our alertness patterns, but this correlates with the cortisol rhythm as well. So like I said, it's going to kind of peak during the morning on waking and then kind of die down throughout the day. And then we'll get little peaks and spikes based on activity. And then metabolic timing, this can regulate metabolic timing as well as hormone release. So you'll hear things like testosterone is highest in the morning when you wake, as a male especially. So there's certain things that it can control as well. And melatonin is technically a hormone as well. So that just is one of those things that we're looking at. Typical daily pattern. So morning, as I mentioned, we're going to have our cortisol peak. And then body temperature is going to rise. So I mentioned body temperature decreasing before sleep, and during sleep, body temperature is going to rise when we wake up. And we're going to have increased alertness because of that cortisol as well. Now, this is a really bad time upon waking to start staring at your phone or going in immediately consuming caffeine or immediately popping in a Zyn and consuming nicotine or hitting your vape or whatever. This is a good time to not do those things because we already have cortisol elevated, alertness is already high, and we don't necessarily want to just start slamming other things on top of that, right? We want to kind of wait for that to chill just a little bit, and this is the time where we want a little bit more peace. We want to, write in our journal, go get sunlight, whatever it may be, if you have the time to do so. So unfortunately, realistically, many of you guys are not going to have the availability to do that. You're going to wake up and immediately have to go. But I still recommend doing what you can, even if it's a few moments. Like just step outside on your balcony, get a little bit of sunlight, even if it's just like a brief 30 seconds, whatever it is. Driving to work, even when you're getting sunlight coming in through your window, is not necessarily a bad thing. So there's a lot of things that you're maybe already doing accidentally that could be helpful. So stuff like that. And then, like I said, it's not necessarily a good opportunity to start slamming things that are just going to make you even more stressed out in the morning if you're in a rush and trying to get to work and stuff. But realistically, doing what we can, there are things that we can control. Then afternoon, cognitive and physical performance peak. So this is usually when we're sharpest, best time to go train. You know, if you're an individual that maybe works from home or is a professional bodybuilder that, you know, maybe you are your job as far as like content creation, brand deals, that kind of stuff. Influencers, if you have a lot of flexibility within your schedule, like afternoon you've probably already naturally gravitated towards training around this time. You may be one of those people that get to the gym super early because you just want to expend that cortisol in the morning, but usually you'll find like 2 p.m., 1 p.m. to 2 p.m., 3 p.m. is like prime time for training. It feels the best in my opinion. You know, it's to each their own kind of thing, but you are going to feel pretty cognitively sharp and physically, you know, performance is going to kind of peak around afternoon time. And then evening, melatonin begins to rise, but this is also going to kind of correlate with that light exposure, as I mentioned. And then body temperature is going to drop, as I mentioned, and sleep pressure combines with circadian signals. So this is when all things kind of sync up, and then that sleep pressure starts to rise. So Danielle, do you notice kind of what I'm talking about here? Like in the morning, do you feel a little bit more like alert and like a little bit more stressed out? And then do you see how that rhythm kind of plays out throughout the day?
Yeah. So I was kind of thinking, I like to think that my most productive time is the morning, and maybe it is because of that alertness and like go mentality. So I think like I can knock all these things out in the morning. And then, like I mentioned, I do kind of have that like window of time in the late morning, early afternoon where my productivity kind of dips. And I know there's, I guess, I don't know, research or after we have like a meal, you know, you kind of get that little bit of like after the lunch slump
Mhm.
and you're feeling a little bit sleepier. So that's why I kind of do have that extra like little boost of caffeine in the early afternoon time. And then then I can have that second like productive little burst in the afternoon. And then my evening is no caffeine. So
100%. Yeah, so I'm going to say some things here that may contradict what I originally said, but this is basically what I'm explaining with this rhythm that I just talked about is like in a perfect world, right? And many of us just we're not able to live in an environment that necessarily coincides with this perfectly or drives this perfectly, if that makes sense. So, you know, if you're consuming stimulants like earlier in the morning, as I mentioned, like even within an hour of waking up, for example, this can start to shift like your cortisol rhythm, a lot of different things that can start to shift here. So that's why many of us experience like that crash in the afternoon rather than it being, or we're waking up really early. Maybe we didn't get in that 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Maybe our circadian rhythm isn't quite synced up or really consistent as far as timing goes. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration here. And if you're experiencing kind of that slump in the evening, that can be maybe a telltale sign that that's part of like a little bit of dysregulation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not trying to call you out, Danielle, or anything, but you know, like I said, realistically, a lot of us have to get to work really early in the morning, or we have like, you know, you have to pick your kids up from school. There's a lot of different life factors that we want to take into consideration here and have empathy about. And obviously we're not out in the wilderness, living in the rainforest, building our own huts and stuff. So our bodies that are biologically designed for an environment that we're not necessarily in anymore. So just trying to make efforts and control what we can to let your body operate in an appropriate manner is what is important here. So if you're experiencing that slump in the afternoon, part of that too is that like maybe you consume a pretty big meal too. So we get that parasympathetic activation where our nervous system starts to relax. And if we're masking our fatigue with caffeine, for example, and we start to get that half-life drop off from whatever that window is, you know, we start to get that drop off where that caffeine starts to expel out of the system. And then we start to get that crash, right? And then the nervous system's like, oh, it's time to relax. But that's actually a good opportunity because some people, if they have the opportunity to, will maybe take a nap around this time. And that's not necessarily the best strategy. Now, it depends on how sleep deprived you are. If you're really sleep deprived, a little 20-minute power nap isn't necessarily the worst strategy. But if you're trying to set up your circadian rhythm, the best thing you can do is really focus on saving that tiredness for the evening and start to set that time a little bit more appropriately in terms of going to sleep at the same time and waking up at the same time. So in the evening, like I said, melatonin will begin to rise. Body temperature drops, as we mentioned, and sleep pressure combines with circadian signals. So this is where like a lot of things come into play. Now, the disruption, we've already talked about a lot about this, but the disruption sources are going to be from late light exposure. So this isn't just about blue light. We're not just talking about blue light here. We're talking about bright light in general. So, dimming your lights is a good thing to do. Using more candlelight if possible is ideal. Going outside on your balcony or just outside and like watching the sun go down could be a good strategy. Staying off your phone or limiting your phone usage can be very helpful here. So just reducing light exposure. In the Western world, it's pretty unrealistic for us to just not consume light in the evening, but reducing it where we can and just being cognizant of it is what's important here. Inconsistent sleep schedules is going to throw this off. So again, waking up in random times is going to kind of throw this off. Waking up consistently at the same time is going to be the most ideal for this. Travel and jet lag can be a big contributing factor here as well. So obviously with time changes, we'll notice big shifts when it comes to like daylight savings and stuff as well. I think Danielle and I talked about that recently too. Well, interesting. I don't have the stat right in front of me and I can't remember what it specifically was, but I know that there is statistically an uptick in heart attacks around daylight saving shifts because somebody that may already be very inclined to heart disease or may be on the verge of having a heart attack or is just like right on the edge of that, something like that happening, a cardiovascular event, the essentially daylight savings, if they miss out on 1 hour of sleep, it can really throw things off their whole rhythm and drive blood pressure up, for example, which can cause things like that. But that's just an example of how that kind of thing, that little shift can throw things off a bit. And that's an extreme example. So don't think just because, don't be scared of daylight savings like we're going to have heart attacks, but it's just an interesting statistic. Night shifts are going to be one of the most deleterious things to your health. I'm sorry if you work night shifts. I'm very empathetic. I understand that sometimes we have to do what we need to do to put food on the table and pay the bills and stuff, but it's one of the worst possible things you can be doing for your health. Sleep is absolutely paramount. Everything we're talking about, if these things are dialed in, is going to be an absolute game changer and arguably the most important thing for your long-term health and longevity, performance, everything across the board, recoverability, just all of it. Sleep is paramount. So if you're working night shifts, it is really, really, really just messing things up. If you're able to, shift out of that, somebody has to do it. I understand. But, if you're able to shift out of that, like whether it's talking to your manager, whatever it may be, if you are somebody that really cares about your health and your performance and all of this is just definitely not an ideal situation. But as I mentioned, I'm empathetic. I know that some of us have to do what we have to do, but I definitely recommend driving. And if you are doing night shifts, working during those night shifts to move into a position where you can have more schedule flexibility or more control over your schedule as well. Excess stimulant intake, obviously, and then timing of that stimulant intake, as I mentioned too. So Danielle, I know that you're very, very busy and you're a great example of this because I'm extremely empathetic towards your schedule and we have managed it extremely well throughout the process of turning you pro and just having a lot of success in general. So, are able to sustain things pretty long term while having a lot of these disruptions at play. So let's speak a little bit on how important it's been for you to control the things that you can control and letting go of the things that you can't control in terms of regulating this stuff so that we can sustain what we're doing.
So, as far as my schedule, I have my times, my breaks where there is more flexibility and that's kind of my time to catch up on rest if I need to. And while that doesn't equal out, on missed sleep, it does help in regards to rest, recovery for training, kind of resetting things. So I think that's something I definitely take advantage of is when I do catch a break, I make sure to take advantage of it. And I'm fortunate to have a really good support system. I don't have kids or anything like that, so I'm just focused on me, and I guess that helps. But yeah, that's definitely one big thing that comes to mind. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, 100%. Just focusing on what we can control and kind of letting go of the things that we can't, right? Because you have your work schedule, you have a career, you have things that you have to be doing. And then just, time management is going to be really important here. Your habits, your general habits, your systems that you have in place, not making excuses. This is like probably the most like overused sort of, I guess, rah thing that coaches, personal trainers, people within our realm kind of utilize. But just not making excuses. Like, stop being a victim when it comes to this stuff, because there's a lot of things you can control. The moment that you start like, oh, I'm a victim of my circumstances, is when you just like completely let go of the things that you can control. There are certain aspects of your life that you can focus on. But when you're like, oh, this is just my life and there's nothing I can do about it, then you're gonna lose out on a lot of opportunity to improve things where you can. So to sum this up, there's kind of like create a little bit of clarity here. There's really two systems that are primarily regulating our circadian rhythm. So we have our biological clock controlling sleep timing, and that's going to be based on, when we go to sleep, when we wake up, as well as light inputs and other inputs in general. Sleep pressure is going to be the second one regulating our circadian rhythm. So this is going to be the accumulation of adenosine as well as our melatonin production during wakefulness. So during wakefulness is when adenosine starts to build, and this is what that sleep pressure is that I mentioned as well. So there's multiple kind of contributing chemicals when it comes to this. And then adenosine binds receptors in the brain and promotes sleepiness. So this alongside with the melatonin that I mentioned as well. And then an important concept of this is like the longer that you are awake, more adenosine accumulates. So this is where, like, if you're digging into like past when you would have gone to sleep, essentially, if you're like staying awake because your mind's just racing or whatever it may be, that adenosine will continue to build up, and you're just building up essentially kind of like sleep debt, if you will, if that makes sense. So sleep occurs when we have high sleep pressure and then circadian sleep signal aligns. So this is why we want to control what we can, get that light exposure. It's pretty simple. Control what you can control. Try to wake up at the same time every day. Dim your lights in the evening, try to reduce the amount of light inputs in the evening, etc. Create a cold environment, wrap yourself in blankets if you need to. This stuff isn't necessarily rocket science, and most people can apply these things. Like I said, even if it's just 30 seconds of sunlight in the morning, I'm sure most people have 30 seconds to spare if they spend 30 seconds less of time on their phone, for example. It's just kind of trade-offs, right? So these are pretty simple things. This isn't like some complex protocol or anything. These are just kind of guidelines. And once you understand these things a little bit better, you can start to implement them a little bit more appropriately and be just more cognizant of this stuff. But Danielle, do you have anything else or any additional thoughts on circadian rhythm or just sleep in general?
I actually forgot to mention, coincidentally, we didn't plan this. Today is National Sleep Day.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh wow, that's awesome. I
Yeah.
love that. Very cool. That got me fired up. I love when things align like that, right?
Yeah, it was meant to be.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. We're going to move into some caffeine stuff. So, caffeine functions primarily as an adenosine receptor antagonist. So, we talked about adenosine as the kind of thing that accumulates throughout the day during wakefulness that kind of gives us that sleep pressure. It starts to pressure us into sleep in the evening, right? And it lines up with the circadian rhythm, the biological clock that we talked about as well. So, it's going to target the A and A2A receptors. And this affects essentially a reduction in perceived fatigue. So as I mentioned, a lot of these stimulants are going to be like a fatigue mask rather than something that is actually giving you energy. So it's almost like it feels like it's giving you energy, but it's almost like just a neurological kind of systemic way of reducing sleep pressure, if that makes sense. It's going to increase dopamine signaling, increase alertness, and improve reaction time and endurance performance. So, caffeine's fantastic. We like caffeine. I like coffee a lot. I don't know what I would do without coffee. It is my like shameless addiction is coffee, but I keep it very, very controlled and responsible. So my caffeine intake is actually roughly, I want to say 100 to 120 milligrams per day. So I wake up, I wait about 90 minutes to 2 hours ish to consume my double shot of espresso. So I wait until my cortisol is kind of peaked and starting to climb down a little bit. Then I'll consume my double shot of espresso, and that is it for the day. I let it clear out of my system, give it plenty of time to clear out of my system before it's time to sleep. Now, I'm not perfect. There's maybe once in a blue moon, I'll consume 2 cups of coffee in a day, but I can guarantee you do not need caffeine for energy. That's what calories are for. Calories are energy. So we're consuming energy through food, right? Caffeine isn't necessarily giving you energy. So you don't want to, let's get this paradigm shift out of the way, is that you do not need caffeine for energy. It's not about energy. We call them energy drinks. We say we drink coffee for energy, but that's not necessarily what it's for. It's not to say that we can't get good performance benefits from it, right? So just when we start to shift that, we start to reduce our cognitive dependence on it, if that makes sense, where we're less reliant on caffeine. Like, oh, I have low energy right now, so I need to drink more caffeine. No, you just have sleep debt. You need to get more sleep, essentially, right? And now it may help like sustain things. For example, like I have, some athletes that are on the roster that are pilots, for example, and they need to stay alert. And I'm totally empathetic that, the sleep may be all kinds of dysregulated, a lot of time changes. Like I mentioned, this is like the night shift kind of thing. It's like, there's not much we can do about that. And sometimes it's just about management, but being cognizant of that and creating that paradigm shift and trying to reduce that caffeine intake or find a balance there is important, because that's going to allow them, when they do have the opportunity to sleep, to get better sleep, right? So if they're super reliant on caffeine and they think that that's what's giving them energy, it may be helping them stay awake. Like if they're flying a plane, obviously they need to stay awake, right? So like I said, there's a lot of empathy there, but we just need to find a balance and kind of a midline, right? And when we have these paradigm shifts where we understand that caffeine isn't necessarily an energy source, then we start to understand things a little bit better, right? So an important distinction, like I mentioned, is caffeine does not create energy. So to sum things up, caffeine does not create energy, it masks fatigue signals. So like I said, it's that adenosine function essentially when it comes to that sleep pressure that we experience and that accumulates throughout the day. It pretty much just kind of suffocates that, if that makes sense. So Danielle, do you kind of notice that, especially like, you may consume caffeine later into the day, whatever it may be. Do you feel how much that affects your ability to sleep well?
I think so, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I feel like you feel that energy, and it's just kind of like it's not really energy, it's blocking the receptors. But so I feel that little bit of energy, but it does wear off. And I think keeping that in mind, or how I've been able to keep that in mind since becoming more aware of it, that will allow me to, and I typically train in the evenings, but I won't take like a stimulant pre-workout. So that's also, I want to say that helps my body. Like by the time I get home, I'm more relaxed and like I'm tired because of that physical activity. Whereas if I was to like take a stimulant or take caffeine before going to, say, later in the evening or before going to work out, and still having that in my system, I think I would be more restless during the evening. I could definitely see how that would impact my sleep.
100%. Yeah, so let's dig into caffeine pharmacology a little bit, and this is going to kind of help explain things in a more technical fashion in terms of why we have certain frameworks around caffeine intake. And any athletes that are on my roster know that I kind of have these frameworks in place when it comes to their caffeine intake, and I kind of harp on them quite often, especially if I see someone's caffeine intake climbing pretty high or sporadic or whatever it may be, or really bad timing throughout the day, or they're slamming pre-workout late in the evening when they go train, whatever it may be. So let's understand the half-life first and foremost. So if you don't understand what half-life is, it's the amount of time that it takes half of a drug essentially to flush out of the system. So for example, if you were to take 100 milligrams of caffeine, well, let's just basically give you what the half-life is of caffeine. So the average half-life of caffeine is 5 to 7 hours, and it can range from 3 to 12 hours. And this can be dependent on the individual. There's genetic variations and enzyme variations specific to individuals that can be genetic. Genetics are interesting because they can influence things too. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know that there's a genetic variation as well that allows certain individuals to essentially fall right asleep after consuming caffeine. That's not to say that they should be doing that by any stretch of the imagination, but there is, it's like either you have it or you don't. I can't remember specifically what it was. It's in that book, Why We Sleep, that I have Danielle reading right now. I read it a really long time ago, but essentially, like, you know, some individuals will be able to have like a shot of espresso after dessert at dinner and then be able to fall straight asleep. Myself, I would never be able to do that. If I consume caffeine, there's no way in hell that I'm falling asleep after that. So, but the half-life is going to average 5 to 7 hours, and it's going to range from 3 to 12 hours, and it can be determined by genetics to an extent. Now, implications where if we have a 200 milligram dose of caffeine at 3 p.m., it may still leave like 50 to 100 milligrams active at midnight for some individuals. So if that doesn't put things in perspective, I don't know what will. You could consume 200 milligrams of caffeine like at 3 p.m. and I'm repeating this. So we can consume 200 milligrams of caffeine at 3 p.m. and still have 50 to 100 milligrams active at midnight. So if you're going to sleep earlier than midnight, consuming caffeine at 3 p.m., it's going to put things in perspective. While you're sleeping, you're going to have 50 to 100 milligrams of active caffeine in your system at midnight. So other variables that are going to affect clearance. Now, this is where functional health can kind of come into play a bit. So oral contraceptives can play a role in this. Liver function can play a role in this. Pregnancy is going to play a role in this. And then things like smoking and stuff can also shift this quite a bit as well. So there's certain things, liver function, digestion is going to be important here in terms of just clearance of anything. So remember, things get metabolized and flushed out, and that includes drugs. So caffeine is a drug. If you have poor liver function, poor gut function, we're not going to be able to flush it quite as efficiently as we would otherwise. So that's pretty much the primary one here that I want to mention. Now, caffeine's effects on sleep. Research has consistently proven this, right? So it's going to delay melatonin onset, and that's partially because of the adenosine functionality here, and then increase sleep latency, reduce slow wave sleep. So this is going to be your deep sleep, which we'll be discussing that in a moment as well. And then reduce sleep efficiency as well. So just how your patterns play out through your sleep, as well as just general efficiency. There's an important point here. Even caffeine consumed 6 hours before bed can reduce sleep time. So we really want to time this appropriately. As I mentioned, I try to time my single caffeine dose about 90 minutes to 2 hours after I've woken up, and then I do not consume caffeine again. So by the time I'm going to sleep, it is pretty much flushed out of my system or almost completely flushed out of my system. So that's why I time it that way, because it lines up. Like I said, cortisol spikes in the morning. I give it a little bit of time to die down a little bit, consume my caffeine before like that adenosine starts to really accumulate in the system, and then allow it to accumulate as the caffeine flushes out of my system. So that's why I kind of have that protocol in place. Now, if you're one of my athletes, you know that my framework is usually 200 milligrams of caffeine per day, and I recommend consuming it before 3 p.m., if not quite a bit before 3 p.m., so that it's nice and flushed out or almost completely flushed out of your system by the time it's time to go to sleep, right? Now, common misconceptions, the ability to fall asleep doesn't mean that we have normal sleep architecture. So as I mentioned, there's that genetic variant where we're able to consume caffeine and go straight to sleep. I know some individuals that are able to do that. They're crazy people, but just because we're able to fall asleep doesn't mean that we have the normal sleep architecture. So when I talk about rhythm, we're talking about REM sleep, REM patterns, all that kind of stuff, which we'll be digging into here in a moment. But this, just because we're able to fall asleep doesn't mean that sleep is good. And I talk about, this is off topic, but I talk about this with THC, for example. So, you know, individuals that may smoke a little bit of weed before bed or whatever it may be, it's not the worst thing you can possibly do, obviously, right? But you may think that it helps you fall asleep, but we have research to support that it affects your REM patterns and the architecture, like I mentioned, of that actual sleep. So just because you're able to get to sleep more easily, doesn't mean that that sleep quality is improved. It can be deteriorating to that sleep quality actually. So same thing with like sleeping pills. It talks about that in that book that I mentioned too, Why We Sleep. If you haven't read it, I recommend reading it. I can't remember the author off the top of my head. Read it a very long time ago, but it helps reframe my mindset when it comes to a lot of these things. But like I said, THC consumption is a good example of this, where it may help you fall asleep. Sleeping pills may help you fall asleep, but that sleep quality is just not there. And that's why everybody's a little bit different here. They may experience different things, but a lot of you will feel, if you consume THC before going to sleep, you felt like you fell asleep faster, but you may wake up feeling groggy, for example. So that's an example of why that is. Danielle, do you have anything to mention here as far as just caffeine's general effects, pharmacology framework that you've put in place, or that I've helped you put in place as far as caffeine consumption? We already talked about your habits a little bit with this, but anything to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking honestly, like I mentioned, I train usually in the evening, and the amount of people I'll see drinking an energy drink, and it's 7, 8 o'clock at night, and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, no. Like, granted, I don't know their life, I don't know, maybe they're a night shift person, but yeah, just being more aware of everything that goes into sleep makes a huge difference. Like, even things like, this isn't caffeine related, but I remember, like, this was years ago when I was kind of experimenting with melatonin, trying to, get better sleep. And I was just like, oh yeah, I think it was like a 5 milligram or maybe 10 milligram, but I think it was like a 5 milligram. And I couldn't understand why I was waking up groggier. And it's because it was affecting like my natural melatonin. And I didn't understand, I needed that increase in melatonin, like decrease in melatonin and like alertness when I wake up. So, yeah, it's just the more I guess.
100%. I'm gonna talk my shit a little bit again. If your schedule is not that bad, like you have a pretty, like we all work hard, right? Like let's say you just have you have a great job, like your work schedule is like you work hard, but it's not that crazy, right? And then you go train in the evening, and you're slamming like a 300 milligram bottle or like can of energy drink. Knock it off. Just stop. Like, listen to this podcast, listen to it again, understand it. Because if you're feeling tired and fatigued, it's because you're doing that. It's not because of the work throughout the day. So just to put it in perspective, but like we said, we're empathetic. Not everybody has the same situation, but if you're somebody that's like always feeling like, oh, I don't understand why my energy is so low, all this kind of stuff, but you're doing something like that, that may be the causation. So look at low hanging fruit first before you jump to conclusions like you have low testosterone or whatever it may be. It could just be that you're slamming energy drinks at the end of the day when you're training, when you really just don't need to be, right? Cool. So we're going to talk about sleep rhythm a little bit. So architecture, as I mentioned, when it comes to sleep patterns. So we're looking at, first of all, REM means rapid eye movement sleep. So REM is often confused with deep sleep. They are two different things. Deep sleep is separate from rapid eye movement sleep. Rapid eye movement sleep is when we're dreaming. Deep sleep, we're actually not dreaming. That's just like things really, really slow down. So in terms of the architecture of what this actually looks like, the stages of sleep is going to be the first stage of REM sleep, and this is going to be kind of lighter sleep. And then, or this is non-REM sleep, sorry. Non-REM sleep stage 1 is going to be a lighter sleep. And this is essentially when we're first falling asleep. Non-REM sleep stage 2 is going to be a memory consolidation. So this is essentially what happens throughout these processes. Non-REM sleep stage 3 is going to be slow wave sleep. And this is going to be our deep sleep. So this is where we get into really deep sleep. And then we enter into REM sleep. This is going to be cognitive restoration and emotional processing. This is when we're dreaming. So this is when you're going to experience dreams. Things can get really intense. And that's why this is a pretty interesting fact. I'm not sure if the literature has changed on this. I haven't looked at any recent research or if there even is any recent research, but pretty interesting stuff. Because we've, like Carl Jung, who was a psychologist long time ago, people like that, they had a lot of theories as to what dreams are for and the function of dreams. But the modern literature tells us that the only thing that we've really been able to come to a conclusion about is that dreams are kind of like therapy, right? So when we talk about cognitive restoration and emotional processing, it's almost like and this is my theory about it, a little bit of kind of speculation, I suppose, but if you're like, throughout the day, you go through a lot of different shit, right? Maybe you get cut off in traffic. There's like little micro traumas, right? Quote unquote traumas, little micro traumas throughout the day. Maybe somebody yelled at you. Maybe you got frustrated about something, whatever it may be, right? You're stressed out about work, that kind of stuff. And during REM sleep, when you're in that position of like dreaming and stuff, it's essentially like therapy, right? So that's when we're getting emotional processing of that, like things that may have happened throughout the day, or maybe things that have happened in the past that you haven't processed yet. That's why sleep is so important. And when you wake up, that's why sleep is so paramount for our mental health as well. You'll notice when you haven't slept well, or you're like on a little bit sleep deprived, your mental health is going to start to deteriorate. And this is partially why, in my opinion and my theory, right? So we're not getting that therapy every night. We're not getting that REM sleep where we're able to process the things that are happening throughout the day. We're not able to flush that stuff out. So we wake up with a clear mind the next day, and we've processed the emotional trauma from the day before, quote unquote trauma, the emotional trauma from the day before. We haven't processed that yet, so we're carrying it over into the next day, if that makes sense. So anything that we experience that next day, it's just more accumulation of shit, right, that we haven't flushed out, and it prevents mental clarity. And that's where we'll start to get a lot of accumulation of just like negativity in our mind, or just bad things, right? So you'll notice when your sleep is a lot better, you feel like a lot clearer each day. You feel lighter each day because you've flushed out these things. Like I said, a little bit of theory, a little bit of science there. But Danielle, do you notice when you get better sleep, like you feel like you've kind of moved past the last day, or the past days a little bit better? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything to this too. I think when I'm actually able to like get good quality and a good amount of sleep, I actually like will remember dreams, like, or have a somewhat of a memory of them. I think when I'm not getting enough sleep or not getting good quality sleep, I don't remember any kind of like dream that I might have had. So I think that I don't know if there's anything to that too. But as far as like mood, definitely my mood is definitely impacted throughout the day.
100%. So a lot of you may like, once I've said that, it may be like you're going to start thinking about it or be a little bit more aware of it. It kind of opens your eyes a little bit. So sleep is like inexpensive therapy. So take advantage, right? It's free. Caffeine tends to reduce slow wave sleep. So if we still have caffeine in our system, it will start to reduce that slow wave sleep, which is our deep sleep, and then increase nighttime awakenings, which prevent us from getting, like I said, these are stages of sleep, right? So it can start to prevent us getting into that REM sleep where we're getting that cognitive restoration and emotional processing in that position where we're dreaming and stuff in actual REM sleep. And this is what I talked about, where we have literature on this too, where like THC, for example, can disrupt getting into that REM pattern, and the stages getting into that REM pattern as well. And then caffeine will increase nighttime awakening. So maybe waking up, rolling around, whatever it may be. That's getting you out of that REM sleep, and then you have to go into those stages again to get into the REM sleep. And the more time we can spend in that REM sleep, the better you're going to feel the next day, and the better general restoration you're going to have, right? Slow wave sleep is critical for physical recovery. So in terms of recoverability from, especially if you're a bodybuilding athlete, high performer, whatever it may be, you may be doing things like high rocks, a lot of running, whatever it is, physical recovery, slow wave sleep is going to be paramount. Growth hormone secretion, this is when a lot of this happens. And then lymphatic drain clearance as well. So, and then we'll go ahead and, I mean, we talked about the sleep patterns a little bit here. Danielle, you added some stuff to that, but we'll go ahead and head into nicotine here. So we've talked about caffeine, we've talked about REM patterns, we've talked about some other things. And now let's talk about nicotine, because a lot of people use nicotine. It's maybe a little bit taboo. Like a lot of people kind of hide it, I suppose. It's not as like, you're not as open about it as you would be with caffeine, for example. We all like, so like, oh, we drink coffee, we post pictures of coffee, we are slamming energy drinks at the gym, whatever it may be, right? But nobody's like, I mean, there's plenty of people, but there's not going to be as many people bragging about utilizing nicotine, for example. So we want to talk about it. We want to understand it a little bit better. Now, there's been a lot of I want to say misinformation. I say that kind of lightly, I suppose, on the internet in recent years about nicotine and its positive effects, right? Now, the issue with nicotine is that the positive impacts quickly drop off. And the reason for that is because of the dependency and because of how addictive it is. So It's like I wish it had didn't have that aspect to it, because it would be fantastic otherwise. It's a great like cognitive boost. It's there's signs that it could be helpful in terms of preventative towards like brain degenerative disease, so like Alzheimer's, that kind of stuff. It has promise, but the issue is the level of dependency and how quickly you become addicted to it, and then the drop off of the effects of it as well once that happens. So the mechanism is it activates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the brain. Neurotransmitter effect: dopamine increases, norepinephrine increases, and acetylcholine signaling increases as well. So we'll feel more alert. We'll feel more rewarded by things. We're going to be potentially more rewarded just by the consumption of the nicotine. So there's a difference here in terms of consumption, right? We think about, let's just talk about three modalities here. We have like Zins, for example, or the pouches, or the gum or lozenges, right? So we'll just like oral consumption. We have like smoking cigarettes, and then we have vaping, right? So the problem that I see, the bigger problem I see with vaping and smoking cigarettes comparative to like using pouches, for example, is that you're doing an act, right? Like there's an act of doing it rather than you're just consuming it while you're doing other things, right? So the act becomes associated with that dopamine. If you're having an increase in dopamine and norepinephrine and neurotransmitters in general, upregulation in those while you're doing an activity, you don't only become addicted to the substance itself, but the activity of it, right? So like the act of smoking. So this is where like vaping and smoking cigarettes can be a little bit more dangerous. And then using something like Zins, for example, if you use a pouch, you're probably doing something else while it's in, you're doing work, or you're like doing chores, whatever. So that's kind of a differentiating factor there. I recommend against nicotine in general, but if you're going to have to pick a modality, pouches, gum, or lozenges are going to be probably the healthiest route, and probably going to negatively impact you the least as far as just general productivity goes as well. So function outcomes, so we'll see an increased alertness because of the upregulation of neurotransmitters, enhanced focus, and then appetite suppression as well. Most people that have used nicotine will be able to attest to this. Nicotine pharmacology. So we talked about with caffeine, for example, with the half-life. Hopefully you guys understand what half-life means at this point. So the half-life of nicotine is going to be 2 hours. So it's going to be a shorter half-life than what we're looking at with caffeine, for example. So it takes about 2 hours for half of it to clear out of your system. Now, one of the effects of this, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more as well, one of the impacts of this is because withdrawal symptoms can be pretty aggressive from nicotine, is because the half-life is so short, we can experience essentially withdrawals while we're asleep. So that can negatively impact your sleep as well, which is interesting and not a lot of people think about as well. So we talked about different forms. There's going to be three primary forms. I would say that most of the population this day and age has moved away from cigarettes, although I have seen like an uptick in it a little bit on social media, which is kind of weird, but we know it's like the most deleterious to your health in terms of consumption, right? But I feel like there's been an uptick in terms of like the aesthetic of it, I guess, for like whatever it is, maybe like a resurgence just in terms of style, like it's like a vintage look or something, I don't know. But there's been a little bit of uptick in that. Vapes, they've been cracked down on. I'm not entirely sure the specifics. I know that they've really cracked down on like the flavor stuff, like when the Juuls first came out, for example. And then, there was like a big surge in like just like all these like big flavored vapes that you could buy. I know that they cracked down on those in Texas. I think it's illegal to sell them now. I'm not entirely sure what the legality looks like in most states, but there's been a crackdown on that for sure. Nicotine gum, you can just pick up at a CVS. And I know coaches that use things like nicotine gum or really small dosages and are able to manage it really well, but most people aren't going to be able to do that. It's going to be a very slippery slope for you in terms of just habitual formation. Lozenges and then pouches, as I mentioned. Zins became really, really popular in recent years. I've noticed a little bit of a drop off, and then there's brands making like essentially marketing off of like the pouches thing, but they're just putting like caffeine in it, for example. So it's just like a new way to consume caffeine, whatever it may be. Cognitive enhancement. So there is going to be some short-term improvements in attention and working memory because of the neurotransmitter upregulation that we mentioned. So this is where it can help with your work. And that's why I mentioned the differences with like pouches or like gum, for example, where it's going to drive your performance. It can be a performance enhancer, like in a performance enhancement drug, if you're doing work while consuming it. But if you're just if you're consuming it and you're doing the act of consuming it, then you're going to become more addicted to the act of what you're doing, right? So that's where like people will pop into Zen and then they get to work, right? But like I said, I recommend against that in general. I don't think that the risk reward is worth it, and you can be plenty of productive without it if we're just not relying on these kinds of things. And then key drawback is going to be dependence potential, and we quickly get a drop off. So like once things are kind of saturated, we quickly get a drop off of the effects, and then we just need more and more and more. Essentially, like we build this big tolerance / dependence, and where you need more and more and more. And then we need more and more to get the effect, essentially. And then we become more and more dependent on that too, because it's harder and harder to fill that void, if that makes sense. So essentially that's what happens. And that's why it's a poor strategy to utilize nicotine, and any positive effects you get from it are going to quickly drop off. And then you're going to have a hard time filling that void. And then you're just going to be like consuming a lot of it. That's where you get people smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, or like having a Zyn in at all times. And then it can become, like I said, deleterious to your sleep, for example. So that half-life is really short. So if we have a drop off, like while we're asleep and we start to get those cravings, I'll go ahead and admit that I have utilized nicotine in the past, so I can speak from experience in terms of withdrawal symptoms. They're not really fun, right? So anybody that has tried to quit nicotine will be able to attest to this, that, it can drive, like, you get really irritable, whatever it may be. If you're experiencing that while you're asleep, that's not ideal. And if you're getting like micro kind of sections of withdrawal symptoms while you sleep before you're able to consume it again the next day, and then you're waking up and consuming it immediately, it's not a good thing, and it's going to negatively impact your sleep pretty aggressively, pretty quickly. So not something that many people think about in terms of experiencing those withdrawal symptoms while we sleep. So Danielle, since we're in the physique sport realm with bodybuilding and stuff, we've definitely seen an uptick in terms of nicotine consumption in our community, haven't we, over the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't have experience. It's just not something that's ever like I've been drawn to, but I've definitely been around other people that have had nicotine addictions, and essentially like very very much dependent on it while bodybuilding too. And I know someone that had done competed while taking a large amount of nicotine, and then came off of, or like broke the dependency on it. I don't know what the verbiage, but stopped taking nicotine, and then a couple years later did a show without it, and there was a significant difference. And I don't know if that has to do with with it being a stimulant. I know we say like taking caffeine pre-workout will like affect your pumps, so I don't know if it maybe has something to do with that too, but I'm sure there's a bigger effect with, when we're talking about I'm sure it was affecting their sleep, I'm sure it was affecting their training, just everything, not just their pumps. But yeah, you go on social media, and I'm sure even for younger adults or teenagers, it's easily at their fingertips to see, and they're seeing, their people they want to look like, the people that they admire doing it, and it's that trickle effect of, if they see it, they want to join in too. And I personally don't see the the benefit of it, I guess. So that's, like I said, it's just not something I've ever been interested in.
Yeah, 100%. I think with physique sports specifically, I think that it's kind of like a combination of things why people tend to gravitate towards it. I think the appetite suppression portion of it is helpful for some people. They think that it helps with their appetite. If they're experiencing a lot of food noise, they may be searching for a reward because they're not able to enjoy food as much. They're not able to go out with friends as much. They may be looking for some sort of stimulation as far as neurotransmitters go. So that could be a contributing factor. But you do kind of, like I said, shoot yourself in the foot, because it's going to negatively impact your sleep, and you do see the difference, right? Now, one thing I want to mention, because we're gonna go into more effects of nicotine here in a second, stuff we've already covered, but I want to make sure we don't miss anything here. But one thing that we do want to take into consideration with both caffeine and nicotine is they're vasoconstrictive. So in terms of blood flow, it's gonna mess up your pumps. It's gonna negatively impact your pumps. It's gonna, if your blood pressure is something that you're trying to manage as a physique athlete as well, that's something we want to take into consideration, because it will increase your blood pressure because of the vasoconstrictive nature of both these drugs. So that's one big thing. So if you think, for example, with like pre-workouts, or consuming like large amounts of caffeine around your training window, if you're wanting to get the best pump possible, you're probably not going to achieve it with caffeine consumption. So if you want better pumps, don't consume caffeine around your training window, to be honest. So, sometimes pre-workouts like have that combination of like pump ingredients as well as like caffeine and stimulants, and they kind of like offset each other, I guess you could say, to some degree. But if you really want the best pumps, then you'd probably want to avoid like driving to the gym, slamming an energy drink and popping a Zin in, or having a Zin in while you train. It's definitely you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot in terms of blood flow. So definitely something to mention there. But nicotine, we talked about dependence potential, but nicotine and sleep, and we talked about sleep as well, but we'll mention a couple other things. So we're going to get increased sympathetic activation, so fight or flight mode essentially with the nervous system. Nervous system is going to be more aroused. And we're just going to have more sympathetic tone in general, which again, if you have something like blood pressure, is blood pressure something you're trying to manage, this is going to drive things up as well if you have more general sympathetic tone. So trying to reduce things where you can. Nicotine is one of those things that we can control. Delayed sleep onset, both because of the sympathetic activation as well as potential withdrawal symptoms while you're asleep, and then increased nighttime awakenings because of that and because of the sympathetic tonality of what your system's being placed in essentially. And then we talked about withdrawal symptoms while you're asleep, and this can cause like micro arousals and fragmented sleep. So essentially you're like similar, this put into perspective, this happens to physique athletes as well. Like when we start to get like our sleep quality starts to really break down towards the end of a prep, part of why that is because your mind is like, it's in a position where you've been in a caloric deficit or an aggressive caloric deficit for an amount of time where your brain moves into a position of survival mode where it's like, hey, it's not time for us to be sleeping right now. It's time for us to be eating food. We need to go find food. We need to go hunt an elk or something and eat and consume it, So similar thing kind of happens where your mind is wanting something else, not sleep. It's like, hey, we're kind of in survival mode. We need to go get this thing to fill the void or whatever it may be. And so like a parallel to that, somewhat of a parallel would be deep in prep when your mind's like, hey, we need to be consuming food, not sleeping right now. Same thing, similar concept to nicotine can be a portion of what we're talking about here. Stimulant tolerance. So we talk about tolerance to nicotine, for example, and caffeine, just stimulants in general. We want to talk about stimulants in its entirety. The reason we're really harping on caffeine and nicotine specifically is because they're most common use. Obviously, we see people using them. We talk about them a lot. Everybody's consuming caffeine. Like I said, there's been a big surge in nicotine consumption within our specific industry over the years as well. Like cigarettes died down and then everybody started picking up these other forms of nicotine consumption, and then it really caught on in our industry. And I think that there was some big misconceptions in terms of like, we saw some positive research on it, but it was misleading because it's like, just because this thing could possibly be beneficial to like this one thing, like for example, brain degenerative disease or focus, cognitive function, doesn't mean that it's something that's sustainable or going to drive positive long-term outcomes in their entirety in terms of what you're trying to accomplish with your goals, right? Does that make sense? So all context dependent, but stimulant tolerance, like repeated stimulant use, can cause adenosine receptor upregulation and then reduce sensitivity to caffeine. So that's where we'll usually see like the tolerance start to build up with caffeine, where we need more and more of it to see the effect, right? And me, for example, I've already explained what my protocol with caffeine is. And when I consume my like 120 milligrams or whatever it may be, whatever my double shot of espresso is, I feel it for sure. Like it hits me. So the fact that I just don't overshoot or like have my dosages like really sporadic or like acute high dosages or anything allow me to maintain my sensitivity to it as well. So it kind of rides that balance. So when you're like chasing more and more and more and you have really sporadic dosing, that's where we start to see those issues. Now the result can be, again, increasing dose required to achieve the same effect. Tolerance can develop within 3 to 7 days of regular caffeine intake. So this is where we start to see that tolerance build up, and then withdrawal symptoms. We see withdrawal symptoms from caffeine as well. So we get addicted to it, just like, not necessarily just like, but nicotine is obviously a lot more addictive, and we kind of explained why with the receptors. But with caffeine, we will see withdrawal symptoms, and there can be dependence here. We'll see things like headache, fatigue, irritability, and reduced alertness. Myself, I can speak from experience. I've been consuming my coffee pretty much every day for my entire adulthood. And if I go without it for a day, which I have obviously, the first thing I'll experience is a headache. So I started to get kind of a headache. I'm like, why do I have a headache right now? And then I'm like, oh shit, I haven't had a coffee. That's why. So that's something that I've experienced. Danielle, like you talked about your caffeine a little bit. Have you experienced any like withdrawal symptoms when you like stop drinking caffeine or you have like a day without it?
Mm. Um, well, what I do like to do, like I mentioned, if I have my windows of where I'm not as busy or I have like little breaks, there's a lot of different factors, but if I'm say like in off season and it's kind of more of a break time, I can kind of assess like, okay, is this a good time to maybe lower down caffeine, or go like, I guess like reset, like don't have caffeine at all. So that is something I like to do when and where I can, to kind of reassess that like tolerance, I guess. But if it's not that time, kind of getting back to your question, yes, definitely. I mean, you feel it, but that's a good thing, right? Because then you know that that amount is all you need. You don't need more than that.
100%. Now, there's an aspect to the dependency that is a little bit less like chemical based and more like system based, if that makes sense. But it's more of like a cycle in terms of what happens here. So we get a poor night, like this is just kind of an example of how we can build dependence to caffeine. So let's just say we have a poor night of sleep, right? And we have fatigue. Now our fatigue is like, now we need more caffeine, right? We're like, oh, we're fatigued. I need more caffeine this day because I feel like shit and I need to be able to get through the day and get through my workload, right? So we increase the caffeine intake. Higher caffeine equals reduced sleep quality because we still have quite a bit of caffeine in our system. Maybe we consume that second cup of coffee 4 p.m. and we still had plenty of caffeine in our system while we were trying to sleep. We have that reduced sleep quality, and then that reduced sleep quality equals more fatigue, and then we're consuming more caffeine. So it's like a snowball effect that we want to try to avoid. So if you get a poor night of sleep, I recommend fighting through it. Like if it's just like like you got one poor night of sleep and you got to get through your work, just get through it. Like I've said, caffeine is not energy. So just remembering that, tell yourself that, have your one cup of coffee, get through it. It's a rough day, get to sleep and reset, like stop the cycle there immediately, don't let the cycle continue to, snowball essentially. So Danielle, I'm sure you experience that sometimes, right? Where you just have like an extra shitty night of sleep and then you're consuming more caffeine and then it's just like, you feel it trickle into the next day instead of like stopping the cycle where you could have, right? We're all human, right? We all experience that, but I'm sure you experience that sometimes, right?
Yeah. I think being more aware of things now, though, I won't let myself do that. Or you have your little tricks. Like yesterday, like I said, yesterday was, um, I didn't have bad sleep or anything like that, but it was a day where I didn't feel like I needed normal caffeine. So um, I was traveling, so I drove through Starbucks and I got a decaf coffee. So like finding those little tricks too of like maybe you think that you're needing more caffeine, well get a decaf coffee instead of a regular coffee and see if like you actually really need that extra caffeine. Which decaf coffee does have a small amount of caffeine in it, but it's like 15 to 30 milligrams maybe.
No, that's a good topic to mention too, is like with some of us, especially myself, like I love coffee. I like the taste of it. I like the warmth of it. Like, a lot of us do. And that's part of like the experience of consuming the caffeine, right? Or if you like the energy drinks, you like the taste of it, or you like the sparkle or whatever. So one thing I've been doing is drinking like tea in the evening, like caffeine-free tea. One of the ones that I really like recently is like roasted barley tea. And it's something that Japanese culture, they drink it like after dinner, and it's like has a lot of antioxidants. It's good for your digestion, but it's just warm and it's nice, and it's kind of like reminds me a little bit of like my coffee experience. So there's other things we can do that don't involve caffeine to give us a similar experience if that's something that you enjoy about it, right?
Hmm.
So some evidence-based caffeine timing based on what we've kind of explained, and I've already talked about this, so just kind of reiteration here, 90 to 120 minutes after waking. This allows for the natural cortisol to peak, to occur, and then to start to drop off a little bit. Late caffeine cutoff, ideally 8 to 10 hours before bedtime. And a practical rule for this is to avoid caffeine after 2 to 3 p.m. for most people based on most people's schedule, right? This is very broad generalization, but these frameworks are essentially what I utilize with my athletes, and then I usually encourage them to stay 200 milligrams or below per day because it's the most sustainable I have found as a coach. Some may push that up to like 300 milligrams. And let me clear this up too. It's not that caffeine is inherently dangerous, because it most certainly is not, right? It's not dangerous necessarily. There's studies that show that we can consume very large amounts of caffeine before we actually have like acute negative health impacts, right? So that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about sustainability within a larger framework and systems progress when it comes to our performance, when it comes to our recoverability, when it comes to physique progress, our general health, managing those things long-term outcomes and accumulatory effects of these things, rather than acute just safety risks, right? That's not what we're necessarily talking about here. We're talking about optimization. But at the same time, we're also not trying to overly convolute anything. Like I said, it's really not rocket science here. Get a little bit of sunlight in the morning if you can. Try to limit screen time in the evening. Get a pair of sundown glasses, whatever it may be. Like, just implementing these little things can be helpful, right? And just focusing on what we can control without being too neurotic about it is really what we're just trying to talk about here. And like I mentioned, the more you understand these things, the more you're going to like make better decisions just on the fly without having to like be overbearing about it, if that makes sense, right? So one thing I did want to mention, I touched on this already, but like pre-workout culture. So pre-workouts often contain like 300 to 400 milligrams of caffeine. Not inherently a bad thing, right? But again, I would probably recommend, if you are consuming pre-workout that has that amount of caffeine in it, I'd probably recommend doing like half a scoop and making sure that you're training in the morning, and definitely not dosing that in the evening. I would recommend stimulant-free pre-workout products if you are going to be training in the evening, and definitely not slamming 300 milligram energy drinks right before training either. Additional stimulants that we'll see sometimes is like things like yohimbine, for example, or clenbuterol during contest prep, more into the PED realm as well. And these are things that we'll probably talk about on a different podcast, but definitely some considerations with those as well. Evening training sessions, sleep disruption during contest prep, and accumulated stimulant load are the concerns here. So these are the things that we talked about in terms of sleep impact primarily, and this is what's going to really impact things long-term in terms of outcomes and ability to perform at a high level. So circadian alignment strategies. So this is just some more frameworks. We've already mentioned some of this stuff, but these are reiterations, kind of summarizing things, if you will. So morning, we want to get bright light exposure within 30 minutes of waking. Movement or training in the morning can be good, not necessarily like your heavy training. Like I mentioned, sometimes like mid-afternoon is a good time to train if you have that available to you. But movement or training in the morning isn't a bad strategy either, because of the cortisol spike and everything. I like to do like a little bit of mobility stuff and just get my body moving because it feels good. Do some like shin boxes, that kind of thing. Open up my thoracic a little bit. It just feels good. It's a good way to kind of start the day. And then hydration, obviously. And then daytime, consistent meal timing can be important here. It's going to be helpful. Avoid excessive naps. So as I mentioned, 20-minute power nap is not the worst strategy, but excessive naps or long naps are going to be a poor strategy here. And then evening, reducing the bright light exposure, limit stimulants, and maintain consistent sleep schedule. So these things are not rocket science. Like I mentioned, we don't necessarily need to be neurotic about these things, but these are frameworks to kind of keep in place. And I think the majority of people can adhere to most of this, right? Athlete specific considerations. So during dieting or contest prep, sleep becomes more fragile. So we mentioned with could be increased PED intake, negative impacts of other specific PEDs we're utilizing. It can be from just being really hungry, whatever it is. Sleep becomes more fragile. Fatigue increases, obviously, because we're placing more allostatic load on the system, whether it's cardio, deep deficit, high training stimulus, lack of sleep, as we already mentioned, and then stimulant reliance increases, and the risk for this is going to be impaired recovery when we need it the most towards the end of a contest prep. Hormonal disruption can be primarily because of the level of stress load on the system. So this is going to be adding additional stress load when we talk about stimulants, and then reduced muscle retention as well because of the elevated cortisol and stress from all of it as well. So balance is going to require something between performance stimulation and sleep preservation. So finding that balance, like I mentioned, and a lot of the frameworks that we mentioned are what are going to kind of help with that essentially. So some of the key takeaways here. We talked about a lot. Hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming. Hopefully that wasn't like drinking water out of a fire hose, right? But I think really valuable stuff. We talked about a lot of good stuff in terms of personal experience with this, what our observations, and then some of the science as well without making it too complicated. So stimulants primarily mask fatigue signals rather than generate energy. Like we mentioned, caffeine is not energy. Calories are energy, right? Circadian rhythm and sleep architecture determine long-term performance. So in terms of getting things dialed in with your circadian rhythm or managing it to the best of your ability, and then the architecture within the sleep in terms of your sleep quality is what's going to drive long-term performance, positive long-term performance outcomes, as well as your physique outcomes, the cosmetic aspect of it, cognitive function, all of it, right? Even your mental health. We talked about how REM sleep specifically is really helpful for managing mental health a lot. So take that into consideration. It's an important aspect of where we're at in current Western civilization is maintaining that and managing it to the best of our ability too, where we can with the low hanging fruit rather than just jumping to like things like therapy and stuff, right? Not to say that therapy is bad. If you need it, please seek that out. Timing of stimulant intake is important, is just as important as dose. So talking about timing, making sure that we have a cutoff, making sure that we're being strategic when we dose it, and then the amount that we dose it, they're both going to be important here. Excessive stimulant reliance often reflects underlying sleep disruption. So we talked about that negative feedback loop where we get a bad night of sleep and then it just turns into this snowball effect. And we want to stop that cycle as soon as it starts to occur, be cognizant of that. And then proper circadian alignment can reduce stimulant dependence. So it's all kind of, like I said, a snowball effect, domino effect, whatever you want to call it, where if we regulate our sleep better, our dependence on caffeine will be less. And we'll just be able to have more balance here in terms of all these things. But this is why we've talked about circadian rhythm and sleep and stimulant intake all in kind of one go with one podcast because of how cohesive they are and how intertwining they are in terms of cause and effect, right? So Danielle, anything to add in terms of takeaways or anything to add, final thoughts or anything?
Yeah, I would just encourage anyone that, like, if that's not something that you really ever paid attention to, that was, I guess, being a little bit more type A personality, where that has been a benefit is, like someone going to Starbucks, like go in and I will look at how much caffeine is in, this size versus this size of a drink. And, having your routine of like, if that's the kind of coffee that you need to get every day, that you're not jumping to a venti size all the time because, it's a hard day or whatever, but making sure that your routine stays very consistent. And if, you're getting 150 milligrams at home, when you brew your coffee, that like, if you have to substitute and go somewhere else and get a caffeine and you end up getting a 300 milligram energy drink, like, that there's, just read the labels, I guess, be more aware of those kind of things because not everyone is, and they just grab and go. And if you're not looking at not just the nutrition facts, but if you're looking at the milligrams of caffeine in certain things, sometimes it can be a bit shocking.
100%. Awareness is the key, right? It's the first step. So understanding things, that's the purpose of this podcast here today. Hopefully it opened your eyes a little bit, broke you free from the matrix a tad in terms of stimulant intake and sleep patterns and just driving better outcomes. And I think that, I'm a big proponent of, any impact we can make, just people listening to this podcast or athletes that we work with or whatever it may be. For example, like if we improve somebody's sleep, we're going to improve their mental health, and that's going to allow them to go about the world in a better manner. And that's going to translate into their loved ones and their kids and whatever it may be, just make the world a better place. So that's essentially what we're trying to accomplish here at the end of the day, right? That's why most of us get into the fitness profession, is to just help people and to make some level of impact. So hopefully this was valuable for everybody. You should know where to find us at this point. On Instagram at Sean Irwin _SeanIrwin, like Steve Irwin, and at Saga Coaching. And Danielle, what's your @ handle?
Danielle _626.
There we go. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in, and let us know anywhere in the comments on Instagram, on YouTube, wherever. Let us know what you want to learn about next, and we'll be happy to oblige. Thank you for joining us. Your journey towards excellence does not end here. We're here to help guide you every step of the way. For more insights and to become a part of our community, follow and subscribe. Your feedback illuminates our path. Be sure to share your thoughts and stay tuned for more episodes.